And thank you for the invitation to speak today. And the topic, as we've heard, is Göbeklitepe. I've titled here an 11,000-year-old Stone Age settlement in southeastern Turkey. Now, this site, I think, is perhaps known to a lot of people, especially with modern social media, etc. It's one of those sites that's pretty much in a lot of the headlines, not just within Turkey, but also internationally. Because of obviously the very impressive archaeology that's been excavated at this site in the past 25, 26 years, meanwhile. You can see at the bottom of this slide a row of sponsors that are involved in the work at Göbeklitepe. Of course, I'm here speaking for a great many people that are involved in this project. First and foremost, of course, we couldn't the close collaboration with the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and of course the Şanlıurfa Museum, who is very much involved with the project as well. We have many other sponsors. For example, I think the most important would be the German Research Foundation, who's been funding our most recent research for the past 12 years. The Dorsch Group is the official sponsor of the site, and I'll be going into their role at the site in just a few moments. So today I'm not to give such. I think it's also important to understand what's going on at the site and the infrastructures of a major site like this, which, as you know, became a World Heritage Site back in 2018. Okay, what you can see here on this first slide is a view of the site from the air. It's a very aerial photograph showing the two new shelters which were constructed just recently. But let's just get into the context of the site first, a bit of archaeological background. Of course, any site, any archaeological site needs its context. And okay, it's 11,000 older than we're putting this site now. And of course, at this time, this was a period which saw the gradual process of people becoming sedentary farmers, the Neolithic revolution, as it were. But of course, this was not a revolution in the sense that it happened overnight, but very much it was a long, drawn-out process which started way back in the Paleolithic, in the late or Epi-Paleolithic, and reached right up until about 7,000 BC and beyond. So this is like a period of 4,000 or 5,000 years. It's in parts of the Levant. An example here being Ohalo-2 down in the southern Levant. And then, of course, domestication of animals would be something that came in, and plants as well, that came in around the mid-9th millennium BC. And pottery appearing around 7,000 BC in southeastern Turkey or in upper Mesopotamia. And of course, you can see that Göbeklitepe here, I put that in here in a grey bar, was occupied from around 9,500 BC to 8,000 BC. So it just covers a small part of, and in fact at Göbeklitepe we don't have any domesticated animals or plants. These were sedentary hunter-gatherers who were still hunting animals, mainly gazelle, and also collecting or harvesting wild grasses, wild plants. So, and they had their pottery. So this is a pre-Pottery Neolithic, and that's what this PPN is at the bottom here. So the Göbeklitepe group, or the Göbeklitepe site, spans the so-called Pre-Pottery Neolithic A and early Neolithic B, and of course pre-pottery, because, as I said, there is no pottery until about 7,000 BC. So that's more or less the background or the setting, the context for the site. And of course, if you look into all the publications, especially the more popular publications, of course, the site's known as, here, for example, a title on National Geographic, the New Stonehenge, or it's been hailed the world's first temples or the birthplace of religion. And so it's not uncontroversial. I mean, is this the case? I don't know. I would rather choose a less sort of risque or less direct interpretation of the site, but we'll go into that in just a few moments. But of course, main thing or the main reason for this interpretation are, of course, these monumental buildings that you can see here with their magnificent limestone T-pillars. Anyway, the site itself, you can see here, we come now to the geographic sort of context, is located not far from the modern city of Şanlıurfa. So here's Şanlıurfa, and you can see the site here, this white dot. It's situated in the so-called Gurmush Mountains, to the north of the Haran Plain. You can see the Haran Plain here, and this is surrounded by a sort of horseshoe shape of mountains or hills. You have the Gurmush Mountains up here in the north. You have a range of mountains here in the west, and a range of mountains, the Tik Mountains here in the east. Here you can see a view from the site. I mean, it's not just the archaeology that's impressive, it's also if you stand at the site on a good day and look to the north, you have wonderful views of the Eastern Taurus Mountains, which are just out of shot here on this map to the north. To the northeast, you have the Karajada, which you can see here. That's a volcanic massif, which is located in about 70 miles to the northeast of the site. And as I said, if you look south, then you have this impressive view over the Haran Plain, and on the horizon would be more or less the Turkish-Syrian border. At the bottom here, you can see an aerial view of the site from a few years back before the construction of those shells you saw, with the main excavation area here and smaller areas of excavation on other parts on the western part of the mound. Research history, I think there are 4 names that you should note when referring or when thinking about Göbeklitepe. First of all, the names Halit Chamber and Robert Braidwood, of course, who were responsible for the surveys that were actually conducted in the 1960s in this part of Turkey, which actually culminated in the discovery of Göbeklitepe, among many other sites at the time. After that, it was more or less dismissed and wasn't actually thought about for a while until 2 German scientists returned in the 1990s, being Klaus Schmidt and Harald Hauptmann. And it was these 2 which actually then commenced excavations in the mid-1990s at the site. You can see here some other milestones. For example, 2011 saw the inscription on the UNESCO World Heritage Tentative List, which, as I said, in 2018, made more permanent by our permanent listing on this World Heritage List. This in red, of course, is the more recent developments that I've been fortunate enough to be part of over the past several years. So we have the whole application process, we have the exhibition and visitor centre built at the site, we have the closure of the site for the construction of these permanent shelters to protect the monument. We had 2019 was Göbeklitepe year, which saw a lot of media attention and me dashing around the world in various talks. The official reopening of the site by the Turkish president in March 2019. And you get an impression, this is from 2019, these photos you can see here, this is a new airport in Istanbul, and we had this one life-size reconstruction at the airport, advertising the site. And you can see here the influx of tourists that we had at the site. And of course, at the same time, we were working down here and it was rather loud and there was lots of questions going on, which is not always easy if you're trying to concentrate and that's part of the course. Okay, the World Heritage Inscription, I keep this brief because I don't want to go into too much detail, but it was obviously a lot of work. And we were I was very happy, and we were very happy to support the Turkish authorities in their application. And you can see here the criteria under which it was inscribed, a total of 3 criteria, it being a masterpiece of creative human genius, an important interchange of human values, an outstanding example of a type of building. So those were the 3 criteria under which the site itself covers a total of 587 hectares, which is rather large. The first degree archaeological site, including the mound and the surrounding plateau, makes up 126 of those hectares, and the buffer zone around it is a further 461 hectares. So it's a large site. And of course, this buffer zone also helps us to protect the site from development. And as I said, this whole story with the world's first temple and the birthplace of religion, that's something skeptical nowadays. We're not so direct in this in talking of the site in this context. And actually, this doesn't find a place in our UNESCO, or didn't find a place in our UNESCO application. Our UNESCO application actually focused on the archaeology and on the monumentality of the buildings, and the symbolism, and the actual interpretation was something that was put more on the side. This is the visitor centre I mentioned to you. This is, you can see, site about 1 kilometre away. So if you actually visit the site, you arrive in your car or on your bus and stop here at the car park. You go in here and collect your ticket. And next door, there's also a new visitor centre with all the latest news and information about the site, which we can update regularly, because of course these are modern swipe screens, very much on your mobile phone, that you can actually go in. So it's very easy for us to update those information boards as and when we need to. And there's also 3 sort of degree experience in various things, which is fun for a while. But when you've seen it 2 or 3 times like I have, then it gets a little bit tedious. But it's a very good place to visit, and it's a wonderful visitor experience. Okay, but before we actually constructed this, or it wasn't us that constructed it, it was obviously the Dorsch group which constructed this. We obviously had to do survey, because this building complex lies just outside of the site. And the interesting thing is that I'll go one on. The site itself, you can see it here, the plateau. The whole region is actually full of limestone and limestone plateaus, but there are a few sort of little islands of basalt, which is like a volcanic stone, which are overlying the limestone. So these sort of brick things here, that's all limestone, and these areas are areas of basalt. And the one in front of the site obviously had a significance for the site at the time, because the people that were living at Göbeklitepe it appears from our survey we did prior to the building of this evidence that they're actually quarrying in this region. So they're extracting basalt, and we know at the site, we know various examples, or many examples, of grinding stones which they were using to actually grind the wild wheat, the wild grasses that they were collecting in the surroundings of the settlement. So this is a very interesting thing. It's one of the few sites with a source of basalt right on the doorstep, as it were. So it's a very interesting thing to have. Okay, let's get back to the last few years, and this slide is about the shelters. Of course, the shelter construction was something that required a lot of preparation, and this is important because these preparations actually led to some of the most important discoveries we've had at the site over the past years. Because what we had to do in order to have the foundations of these 2 new shelters, the legs of these shelters had to be sort of drilled and anchored into the underlying rock, and to do that, of course, we had to remove all of the archaeological several deep soundings in this region, several deep soundings in this area of the site, where we had to remove all the archaeology so they could actually drill in the legs of or anchor the legs of the new shelters. It was a challenging process, obviously, because it was small areas. The drilling was obviously causing a lot of vibrations. So we had to make sure that the site was protected. The whole of the area, or the excavation areas, were actually filled with geotextiles and sand sacks. So, and of course, we were there most of the time just to, we were there, accompany the building process. Here you can see a few impressions of that work, which obviously sends a shudder down any archaeologist's spine when he's looking at them, because of course there's very a lot of archaeological remains under there which are very, very delicate, and you don't want them being damaged. But I'm pleased to say that all our protection measures worked, and the whole thing went well, and we had no breakages, no damage. Yeah, and then, as I said, 2019 was a reopening. 2018 came the UNESCO World Heritage inscription, and then the visitors we had. I mean, before this, it was actually just a few. It wasn't as many as this. And then in 2019, between February and October, for example, I have some numbers. We had over 300,000 visitors, which is 37,000 a month, or around 1,200 per day. But of course, that wasn't equally spread over this period. We had a lot of people coming at the weekend, on bank holidays, that sort of thing. When this sort of thing happened, when the car parks were overflowing, when the visitor centre was overflowing, the shop was overflowing. See here in 2009, we were actually 8th. 2019, we were 8th in the list of most popular destinations of archaeological sites. Yeah, I want to show this as well because this is something also which brings people to the site. I mean, as an archaeologist, I have to see this a little bit, some of these things with a little bit of a, yeah, skeptically, obviously. I mean, I think most of you are aware of Netflix and the series Atier, which featured Mabel, you might say. And of course, that did bring people to the site for a while. We had questions from visitors about where was this, where's the cave, where Atier was, and this sort of thing. Of course, it does bring people in, but of course, you have to ask, is it bringing the right people in? But of course, I think it's about bringing. I think it's still a very important thing because it's bringing in people perhaps who would then learn more about the site, and that's a very important factor. And of course, there are different stakeholders involved at the site. It's not just about archaeology, of course, but we have to think of the other stakeholders, like the local councils, like the local communities, who of course are very much dependent on the financial side of the site. And that's obviously, you can see here that most recently there are now hot air balloon rides at the site. When will be, I think, much like we have already at Cappadocia. And one of the most recent things I found is quite amusing. We had this metal block appear out of nowhere. I think there was a case of it in the US where this metal block appeared in the middle of nowhere. And this actually was repeated again in at Göbeklitepe, just outside the buffer zone, and it appeared in the local village. And it was actually there for just 3 or 4 days and then sort of disappeared. But it was related to advertising for the space plan of the Turkish government, which was released just recently, and it was part of the media campaign to do with that. And it disappeared after 3 or 4 days, and the local villagers were quite disappointed that it was gone because it did bring a lot of people to their village and a lot of attention in the media. Anyway, so those really the stakeholders that are involved. A lot of the local community have been working at the site in many different roles over the past 2 decades, as workmen during the excavations, or as guards, or now more recently in the shop or in the ticket office at the bottom of the site. So let's get back to the archaeology again. I mean, this is why we're here, I think, and I think I'll start off with the most important feature of the site, and that's these monumental buildings, which have been referred to as temples. I refer to them now as special buildings because they are of and special, and I think this is a very neutral way of referring to them without putting interpretation onto them. So in the last, or since 1995 when excavation started, a total of 8 of these special buildings have been excavated, but none of them have been excavated completely. They're all partially excavated, as you can perhaps see in these photos. But this is a main excavation area, and this is where most of them actually are located. So we have building A, which was actually the first, they're labeled alphabetically in the order of their discovery. So we have A, we have B, C, and D. We have G over here, and I think, here's an aerial shot of the site before the new shelters were built. There's a wooden shelter over the main excavation area prior to the new shelters that we have. That was constructed back about 2012 or 13, I think it was before my time, perhaps 11. And you can see here the location of these different buildings. So A, B, C, D, as I said, G is here, F is over here on the southwest mound, H is in the northwest part of the site. E is over here. There are obviously further structures that can be expected that haven't been excavated yet. This is a radar, a ground-penetrating radar image that was made several years back by Klaus Schmidt at the time. And you can see here these anomalies appearing. Now, we don't know whether these are actually special buildings like those that we've seen in the main excavation area, which you can see down here. But they are indeed round oval, which is a characteristic of these building. There's going to be two anomalies here in the center, or roughly in the center, which could be the pillars that we can see in these buildings over here, for example. But we have to be cautious here because, of course, we have excavated in this area, but what we see here in this radar, we didn't actually encounter in the archaeology, perhaps because it's further down. So perhaps these are buildings or building structures, or they could be perhaps the formation, the limestone formations, underlying natural limestone formations of the rock. I mean, this one here would be rather large. I mean, the building down here is about 30 meters in diameter, so this one is more or less twice the size. But you know, we have to be realistic here. We have to be very cautious whether we're actually dealing with archaeological structures or with natural limestone formations. So characteristics of these monumental buildings, I've already mentioned the round oval shape and the two more or less central pillars, which are freestanding. The walls incorporated into T-pillars. I mean, these large ones in the center can be up to 5.5 meters tall, and the ones here around about incorporated into the wall can be 2.5 to 3 meters in height. It's very important to note that these pillars were never freestanding, the ones in the walls, because they were incorporated into the walls, that were slotted in, as it were. So we're not talking about a Stonehenge, we're talking about a building. This building has walls, it has two central pillars, and we think it had a roof. Okay, so it's a building and it's not a stone circle. The pillars, some of them are decorated, as you can see here. This one is a special one because it actually tells us that the T-pillars, in fact, are a human representation. The top of the T would be the head, and the shaft of the T is in the body. We have here on this example, we have the hands on the stomach, we have a belt and a belt buckle and a loincloth hanging down. And you can see here also the floors of these buildings. This is actually the smooth bedrock, the limestone bedrock was here, in which these T-pillars stand, have been carved as well from the stone. So this is all one piece. It's all part of the limestone in situ, as it were. It's the local limestone that's actually just been carved down and smoothed, and then they slot in these rather large 5.5 meter long T-pillars into those slots. And one thing, of course, that we have to mention is that these buildings were excavated. They were full of debris, of rock debris. Originally, it was thought by it was a ritual backfilling of the buildings. Meanwhile, we think there are other reasons involved, but this has to do, again, with the new results that are coming out, and we'll come to that in a minute. And here you can see a view from the plateau. This is the hill in the background, and here we have the plateau with this T-pillar that's still in its quarry position. They carved it and they left it for some reason. Perhaps it broke during the carving process. But you can see here in front of this, a lot of rock has been removed, so we can actually take over to the site. Yeah, how was it moved? How was it done? That's a frequent question. Of course, I haven't done it myself, so I can't only make educated guesses. This is the educated guess from the museum, which shows the T-pillars on wooden rollers being dragged with ropes. But you can see here, this is one of the pits on the plateau surrounding the site. So we have this negative of a large block that was taken out. You can see these, I don't know what we'd call them here, these where stakes were positioned, and that was used to actually split the limestone, because the limestone is as far as I've learned, easy to split, and this would have then enabled them to remove the block from the pit, from the plateau. Yeah, so as I mentioned, Göbeklitepe is often referred to as the world's first temples and the birthplace of religion. Meanwhile, in the recent advertisement, it's referred to also as a 0 point in time. Okay. According to our new results, it's actually probably wrong. So previously, the arguments put forward for this interpretation of the world's first temples is firstly an absence of domestic buildings. It was actually said that the site was purely full of ritual monumental structures, temples, and there was no one living there. In support of that, they said there was an absence of water sources, so there was no local springs or rivers. Thirdly, there was the intentional backfilling of the buildings at the end of their lives, so there is no ritual way at the end of the use lives of the buildings, very much as if you bury a dead person. Then there was the evidence for feasting and beer brewing, which was thought then to go along with this interpretation. But as I say, let's now look at the new evidence that's coming out of Göbeklitepe. This is an area in the northwestern part of the site. It's where we have building H. You can see building H here. And these are the deep soundings I mentioned that were done or excavated for the construction of the new shelter in this part. This is the one that's triangular in shape. Now we're going to go now to trench number 5 and to trench DR2. Trench number 5 is this here, and as you can see, these structures are certainly not monumental, and there are no T-pillars in sight. Furthermore, you can see they're actually multi-phase, and this area is perhaps the most important. This is an activity zone with fireplaces, so-called hearths, multiple hearths, one top of another. And in this activity zone, we have evidence for flint knapping, we have evidence for people working with bone tools, and we have plates from bird bones and stone. So really, it smells domestic, as it were. And if we compare that, if we firstly go on and look at this in detail, this building down here has multiple floor levels, as you can see. So each time people came here, or every so often, they're renewing the floors. We have floors actually one on top of another. So when one building fell out of use, they built another building. And this agglomerative sort of way of building is also very typical. In Göbeklitepe here, and these are other contemporaneous sites in the region. And this is an example from Jebel Ahmar in northern Syria, very similar picture, and here from Halanchemi, which is in the Tigris region. So we're actually thinking now we have domestic activity, and these round buildings are very characteristic for this PPNA period, so from around 9,500 to about 8,700 BC. We have finds as well that go along with that. Before radiocarbon dating, a lot of these datings were based on the presence of certain types of arrowhead in this case. So here we have two characteristic types of arrowhead from this PPNA period. This is so-called Jordan Valley and Tel Caramel point. And then we have here El Kiam point. So this is all very typical from this PPNA period. This is the other trench I wanted to show you, DR2. This is where a water drainage channel went in, and we had to go in there as well and do a trench for the water drainage from the new shelter. And you can see here another similar to those we found in the other trench that I showed you. And here's a little view into those trenches. Then if we go on, the settlement continues, and the most interesting thing about this, I'll come to the lithics in a moment, but the most interesting thing about this is that around 8,700 BC, we enter the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. And one of the changes that goes along with this transition from PPNA to PPNB is the introduction or the appearance of rectangles. Around 1,700 BC, that people actually invent the corner of buildings. Previously they were round, and now we have increasingly rectangular shaped buildings. Why that was, it's difficult to say. Perhaps it was easier to build next to one another and save space. Perhaps it was easier if you had a storage box. Boxes are generally square, you can put them in a corner. So, you know, there are various reasons why one might build rectangular buildings. But this transition from round buildings to rectangular buildings happened to transition from Pre-Pottery Neolithic A to Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. And what's very exciting here, we have for the first time a building which we can see here the round floor, but this building was then demolished or taken apart, and a rectangular building put on top of it. So this is very exciting, something we don't usually have, we haven't seen at very many sites before. Back to the domestic interpretation, we have here lithics or stone tools found in this building that was excavated. That was a lot of stone assemblage. It was actually worked on by one of our PhD students, and the actual, you know, the assemblage is then sorted, and we have different sorts of things that you can be sorted, like we have flakes and blades and cores and tools. We have different types of tools, arrowheads, microliths, perforators. But what I'm trying to say here, this whole assemblage, is very characteristic for a domestic settlement, and we can see that compared to other domestic sites. So it's not a special assemblage. It would be perhaps related to just a modern one. And again, this is this building. You can see here the round floor, which was then turned into a rectangular building later on. And that's located here in the northern part, just north of these special buildings. Then we have here a rectangular building here in this area, and this is another type, or a building type. This is work done by our building archaeologist Moritz Kinzer, and you can see here that he's identified a number of buildings dating from the PPNB, so these rectangular buildings, so we're talking about mid-9th millennium BC. And you can see that they have certain characteristica, which means we can make a type. We have here a bench, we have a T-pillar in them. You can see here an example from another site, Habetswentapesi. So it's not just Göbeklitepe, there are other sites. I'll come to those in just a second. But we have here a building type, we have a bench, we have a T-pillar put in, we have a niche in the corner here. And it would appear that what we have here in the archaeology is just the cellar or the basement of these buildings. In fact, there was an upper story or a floor on top of this. So these are the domestic buildings. And actually in the cellar, they have these T-pillars, which would also fulfill a function of support for the building itself, for the roof, or for the floor above. And yeah, this is something quite exciting. And if we imagine that all of these buildings here are contemporaneous, then by the PPNB period, so middle of the 9th millennium BC, we're dealing with a very flourishing, very busy settlement. And of course, the dead. We need the dead people that used to live at the site. This is an image of a few photographs. This is in this area here. So this is where the other new shelter is, over the main excavation area. We did another excavation of a long trench for a drainage pipe to take the rainwater away. And here we hit a rectangular structure, so PPNB structure, and here we had this kidney-shaped pit in the floor, which when we excavated, as we thought, turned out to be a subfloor burial. Now, you have to know that is that people weren't buried in a graveyard away from the settlement, but were actually interred and buried within the settlement itself, very frequently under the living room floor. So if whoever passes away, your granny, your granddad, whatever, then the first thing you do is, of course, is make a hole in your living room floor and put them underneath. So the dead are always with you. So this was a very great discovery for us, because this is one of the first proper very much characteristic of other settlement sites from this period in the region. So another indication that we're dealing with a domestic settlement. And this is a view of that burial. You can see here we've got 3 individuals. The burial was disturbed, so it's out of context, but there's still a few bones in articulation. But it's 3 individuals, one female 11 to 14, one female older than 35, and a male female between 20 and 30, which is quite, because the preservation was not so good. And that was a very exciting discovery, as I say. What else do you need? You need water. Now, this is a map of the site showing the course, or how water drains from we have the main excavation here, and this is where the water drains from the site, the rainwater, and all these little pink dots here, those are little cisterns or channels carved into the plateau to actually direct the water into the cisterns themselves. So it would appear they were collecting rainwater or harvesting the rainwater. Now, these cisterns were in fact Neolithic. There was nothing to date them until more recently, when we had, one of these was excavated in the 1990s, and at the time it produced, or early 2000s, it produced some human bones. These human bones were taken to Germany and were forgotten about. And then just recently they were looked at, and it was found that they actually had scratch marks on them. So it actually appears that we're dealing with a secondary burial of, and this is quite characteristic as well of the Neolithic period, of this period in the Neolithic, that bones were taken from burials. They were actually, they took the bones, the long bones mainly, which is the case here, and they put them in a secondary burial place. And apparently it would appear that one of these cisterns was used as a secondary burial for these Neolithic individuals, which would then date as it were, these systems into the Neolithic period. So it's used as a dating agent. So we can now actually say that probably all of these, or most of these systems and the channels are in fact Neolithic in date. And most exciting as well is a discovery made in that context here, 2 and 3, these deep sounding things we can see here, carved here at this position. It's actually covered by limestone slabs, which keep out the dust, or keep out, so it keeps them all people or animals. But interestingly, it's just 10 meters away from this trench here, where you found this feature. This is a very deep rock carved pit. It's just unique anywhere, I think, in Southwest Asia, or anywhere in the world, in fact, at this time. A deep pit carved into limestone, 8 meters across, 3 meters deep, and with a small channel in the here with a system for collecting water as well on site, which would be very important. Okay, let's come to the special buildings again. Now, what we did here, and this is obviously a bit confusing perhaps for many of you, but this is just showing you some radiocarbon data that we collected from the buildings in question, the special buildings, and these are telling us how old they are, more or less. I mean, these samples that we submitted for radiocarbon dating, as you may know, radiocarbon dates are made on organic remain on the amount of 14C still contained in the samples, and then we can actually work out the calendar age of these samples. And these samples were taken, this is mainly charcoal, small pieces of charcoal taken from the mud mortar in the walls of building D. And you can see here, quite surprisingly, in fact, we always thought, because they were round buildings, that these special buildings were PPNA in date, i.e. 9,000 or so BC. But now we see these younger dates, 8,500. So this means that the buildings longer lived than previously thought. So they were actually the same age or older, but they lasted for perhaps 500 or 600 years. So they were actually the same age, or contemporaneous still, overlapping with the rectangular buildings, which I showed you just previously. And it's quite interesting if we look at these radiocarbon data in combination with some results from the building studies, archaeology studies done. A lot of these, what you can see here are 3 phases of building D. These buildings, special buildings, they started off as very large, round, oval buildings. Then within that, another building was built. And within that, another building was built. So very much like these Russian dolls. So you start off with a large one, and you put a small one in that one, and a smaller one in that one. This is what they were doing. And these dates come from different colored parts of the wall, so different phases. That's what explain it. And it also tells us that this old phase here was probably PPNA, 9,000 whatever BC in date. And this younger phase here was 8,500 BC. So the building was in use for 500 years. And this applies to all of the building, all the special buildings, in fact, in the main excavation area, A, B, C, and D. And that gives us then this new chronology of the site. You can see here the A, B, C, and D, A, B, C, D, and you can see here the different colors, all representing different phases. So you can see here, for example, this phase of C here was actually the same age as the orange parts you can see up here. So the buildings, the special buildings, although they started earlier, their first phase or later phases, they are actually contemporaneous with these younger buildings you can see surrounding them. So as I say, a very different situation as previously thought. Previously it was thought that the round buildings were then covered up and the rectangular buildings came. No longer the case. So the fill of these buildings we've looked at as well. Previously, it was said that they were richly buried like a dead person at the end of their use lives. Now, looking at the stratigraphy, we don't think that was the case. Here now, the rectangular buildings are up here. Here's the special building at the bottom. And what happened? We had landslides or slope slides coming in with these buildings. Actually, the buildings up here were slipping in to the special buildings down below. Okay, because the site itself, these special buildings are in a dip, and the slopes surrounding are where all the domestic buildings are. And if we look at a reconstruction of that, here you can see a reconstruction. This would be some point rectangular, so this would be somewhere around about 8,600, 8,700 BC. They're having problems with the slopes. The slopes are unstable. Perhaps, if you have heavy rainfall or the occasional earthquake, this is problematic. But at some point, these precautions and the rebuilding and the repairs that were done, they didn't hold up. And at some point, the slopes slid and these buildings became buried. And then again, even after that, they tried to repair. They brought in these terrace walls and tried to keep things. It's a long story of a site. You have to remember that Göbeklitepe was in use for 1,500 years. There were people living there for at least 1,500 years, which is like from now back to 500 AD. So a very long period of time. To the beer, yeah, I mean, it's a great hypothesis, and it would be interesting, or it would be, it's a nice story. But again, we have to be very careful. The evidence is very tentative, and the samples taken from these troughs, limestone troughs, which came back positive, try again to replicate these analyses, but they all came back negative. So we have to be very careful. How we interpret these results. Was fermentation even, if it was fermentation, was it then intentional fermentation, or was it something that just happened by accident? We have to be very careful, and more careful, I think, with regard to this evidence. So this is then the reconstruction as how it was reconstructed up to about 2014-15, and how it's been reconstructed recently. So, as I say, previously it was interpreted as an intentionally backfilled monumental site with purely ritual function, and now we say no. We have a domestic settlement, which you can see here on the slopes, with this focal or at least three special buildings here portrayed as a focus of those communities. Okay, that's just a summary of what I've been talking about. So why were they buildings, absence of water sources, intentional backfilling, evidence of feasting and fermentation or beer? And of course, now you've just seen the new evidence that I've put across, or we've discovered in the past 4 or 5 years. We have domestic buildings, we have cisterns, we have slope slides, and not intentionally buried buildings. We have no sound archaeological evidence of feasting, and the evidence for fermentation is very tentative. Okay, I just want to make you, I think we have, I just want to give you a bit more of a introduction or to the context of the area. Göbeklitepe was not the only site at this time. You've seen a few of the sites that I've mentioned, Jurfel Atma, for example, Halan Chemiha I've mentioned, but there were others. What you can see here, in fact, is a whole list of sites. These are all Neolithic or Epipaleolithic sites from northern Iraq, the Tigris region, so eastern, southeast, sort of the Euphrates Valley, where Göbeklitepe is also situated, and the Tipila sites around Urfa. And these are the radiocarbon dates that you can see. So you can actually see that sedentary settlements, as we now know, first appeared in the Tigris region, for example, and also in the upper Euphrates, in the so-called Younger Dryas, which is a period before the present Holocene. So it's a period that's sort of associated with cold conditions and dry conditions. And then after that, we had the end of this sort of Pleistocene period, or the end of the Younger Dryas. These are climate proxies from the Greenland ice. It's a proxy for air temperature and temperature of the planet, as it were, and it shows the increase in the recent thousands of years. So you can see that all of this was taking place against a background of climate change. So here again, the Younger Dryas. Up here is Göbeklitepe. You can see the dates here. So this would be the beginning of the Holocene. So the cold, arid conditions stopped, and then we have this sort of dearth, this whole of after the cold Younger Dryas in these new sort of wetter, warmer conditions. Let's look at these sites on the map. So this would be the settlement of the southeastern Turkish region, or upper Mesopotamia, in the so-called Younger Dryas, so around 10,900 to 9,700 BC. So you can see a few sites in the Tigris basin or Tigris Valley here. You can also see a couple of sites in the Euphrates. In the Urfa region, where there are actually no sites from the Younger Dryas. There are a couple of possible sites known from surface survey, but nothing that we can be sure about. No excavations. This is in the PPNA period, so the oldest phase of Göbeklitepe. We have a possible site also in the modern city of Şanlıurfa from this period, named Yeni Mahalle. This is now where there's actually a big hotel on this site now, and it's in the centre. It's not far from the famous, where it is actually in the centre of Urfa, of the old city. And that we have increasing numbers of settlements along the Euphrates and also along the Tigris. And then in the PPNB, this is a time when the rectangular buildings come in. We see that a lot of the sites in the Tigris region and also along the Euphrates in northern Syria fall out of use and disappear. But we appear to have a real sort of explosion of sites in the Urfa region. So Göbeklitepe is still in use. And also the two black dots here. These are articular sites, so of the same type site that we have at Göbeklitepe. And so far, we think from the surface finds that we have, we think that majority of these sites, or probably most of these sites, date to the early PPNB, so to this period here, mid-9th millennium BC. Here we have a few examples. Excavations started a few years back at the site of Harbetsuantepesi, which is over here. You can see here this character. We saw this photo earlier when we were looking at the type building that I introduced to you, the rectangular buildings with the bench and the two pillars. The basement, or as it was, of this building. So we have the same building type over here in Harbetsuantepesi. Here an aerial view of that building and the excavation site. And then more recently, that's also been in the media, the site of Karahantepe, which is also not far from Harbetsuantepesi, also in the Tek Tek Mountains. And here you can see, as at Göbeklitepe, they have what is still lying there that wasn't actually removed after it was quarried. And here a few shots of the architecture of that site. But excavations are still in an early stage. They started just a year or so back. But the most exciting thing is that the site of Göbeklitepe and Karahantepe are now part of one single project. The new Kazabashkana, the new excavation director, is Professor Necmi Karul from the Istanbul University. And of course, we are very close. We're working very close, obviously, with at Karahantepe and at Göbeklitepe. So it's a bigger team. So this is what I said just now. So we have this sort of PPNB, sort of in the 9th or mid-9th millennium. We have this sort of influx of sites, or the more increase of sites in the Urfa region, and we have this sort of decrease in these regions here in the Tigris and the northern Syrian Euphrates Valley. And the question is, were these perhaps people moving in from these, why that could have been, if that was the case, if it was climatic, we don't know. But we have to remember, and I think this is also important with regard to the function of the special buildings at Göbeklitepe. They had obviously a function. If they weren't temples, what were they? I think they were very important for actually keeping the group, the hunter-gatherers, together at a very challenging time. If we remember, this is a period where we saw the gradual domestication of animal, people becoming more and more sedentary, staying in one place. What happens if you stay in one place and live in one place? You have more children, the population increases, you have more stress on resources, you have more stress within society, you lose track of your neighbors. And that, of course, leads to sort of conflict, to problems within society. It also leads to people having more than others. So this period would also be a period when we saw the first sort of the haves and the have-nots, those that have more than other people within society, which would also cause problems between groups and between individuals. And one way of combating these problems at the time would be to have sites where the group identity is emphasized. And I think that's what's happening at Göbeklitepe. And if you look at these round oval structures, then what we see here And if these T-pillars, as we know, these T-pillars are depictions of human beings, what we see here is a group of people sitting around to other people. So it's actually a meeting. The people are actually gathering in a meeting. They're looking into these two important figures in the center of the building. And many of these, or some of these pillars, are decorated with various motifs. I haven't shown very many today. I'm sorry about that, but we can't do everything in an hour, unfortunately. But what you see here, you have a lot of animals depicted, wild animals. Obviously, there are no domesticated animals, as we know from Göbeklitepe, but we have scorpions, we have vultures, we have cranes, we have snakes, boars. We have here a human figure missing the skull. This is quite frequent as well. Sometimes certain individuals, when they're buried after their death, they're buried, and after a certain amount of time, the skull of the individual is exhumed and taken from the grave. They didn't wait too long, and they had to actually clean it, sort of scrape off the remaining hair and the flesh that was still attached, and you have scratch marks on the skull. And these skulls were then possibly displayed or brought out at some point, and those are probably it's part of ancestor veneration. So perhaps what we're seeing here, these individuals in the circle, are actually ancestors sitting in the building. They're representing ancestral individuals or groups of individuals. That's supported by finds of human skulls that come from the site. Here are a few fragments of human skull. You can see here these deep grooves and these drilled holes, which we've reconstructed as ways of actually displaying these skulls with special cells. So the ancestors played a role. It was all about identity and perhaps keeping the group together at a time of considerable challenges related to this change in lifestyle from hunter-gathering to sedentary farming. Okay, I think I'm through. Thank you very much for your attention. And as we said at the beginning, I'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have.